You are standing at the bottom of a canyon, and you have never left the city. The walls are alive. They breathe steel. They sweat glass. They hum with 10 million decisions made by 10 million people who never once agreed on anything, except to build higher than the person next to them. Nobody planned this. Nobody drew a map and said, here, this is where civilization reaches for the sky. What you are looking at right now, this jagged, violent, impossible silhouette, is the result of secrets, sabotage, grief, geology, and one man who stood on an elevator and told someone to cut the rope. This is not a story about buildings. This is a story about you and what happens when human beings refuse to accept the ground they were given. It starts, as most American stories do, with land that was not empty. The Lenape people lived on the island they called Mannahatta, island of many hills, for thousands of years before a Dutch trading company arrived in 1626 and purchased it for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. That transaction, probably the most lopsided real estate deal in human history, set everything in motion. The Dutch built a small fortified trading post at the southern tip of the island. The English took it in 1664 and renamed it New York. And for the next 2 centuries, the city stayed flat, modest, and deliberately close to the water. What was New York waiting for? It was waiting for bedrock. Here is something most people never think about. Manhattan sits on a geological formation called the Manhattan Schist, an ancient, brutally dense metamorphic rock that rises close to the surface at 2 specific locations on the island. The southern tip, where the financial district now stands, and the area beginning around 34th Street, stretching north into Midtown. In between, the bedrock plunges far underground. And you cannot build a skyscraper without anchoring it into solid rock. The cost of drilling deep enough through the middle of the island made it economically impossible for most of the 19th century. This is why, if you look at a map of Manhattan's tallest buildings today, they cluster in 2 distinct pockets, downtown and midtown, with a valley of shorter, quieter buildings between them. The shape of the skyline you recognize instantly, the silhouette that every child draws when they draw a city, was decided by geology, formed 500 million years ago. But geology gave New York its shape. It did not give it its height. For height, you need the elevator. And for the elevator, you need a man willing to prove that falling is not inevitable. In 1852, a mechanic named Elisha Otis invented a braking mechanism that would automatically catch an elevator car if its cable snapped. Elevators existed before Otis, but nobody trusted one with their life. The fear was not irrational. Cables broke, platforms collapsed, people fell. Otis changed the psychology of height in a single afternoon. At the Crystal Palace Exposition in New York in 1854, he rode an elevator platform to a dramatic height in front of a crowd, then had an assistant cut the cable with an axe. The brake caught. The platform held. Otis stood completely still and said, calmly, to the gasping audience, "All safe, gentlemen." That moment did not just sell elevators. It unlocked the vertical dimension of every city on Earth. Upper floors, once a punishment for tenants too poor to avoid climbing stairs, became premium, became desirable, became the most expensive square footage a human being could occupy. What happens when up becomes valuable? People race to get there first. The structural key that made true skyscrapers possible arrived in Chicago, not New York. In 1885, architect William LeBaron Jenney completed the Home Insurance Building, a structure that carried its own weight through an internal steel skeleton rather than through thick masonry walls. The walls became a skin, the skin became glass, glass became light, and the moment that principle crossed into Manhattan, something primal was unleashed. Competing companies, competing egos, competing fortunes commissioned buildings that climbed higher with each passing year. The Park Row Building in 1899, the Singer Building in 1908, the Metropolitan Life Tower in 1909. Each held the title of world's tallest for a season, sometimes for months, before the next one arrived and erased it. Then, in 1930, 2 men decided to make it a personal war. Walter Chrysler, automobile magnate, was building his monument to himself on 42nd Street. Simultaneously, a consortium was racing to top out 40 Wall Street, financed by a Manhattan bank. Both projects knew they were in a race. The team behind 40 Wall Street believed they had won. Their building reached 927 feet. They made the announcement. What they did not know was that Chrysler's architect, William Van Allen, had been secretly constructing a 185-foot stainless steel spire inside the crown of the Chrysler Building, hidden from view, assembled in pieces while the public watched the exterior and assumed the building was finished. The day after 40 Wall Street declared itself the tallest building on Earth, workers hoisted the hidden spire up through the top of the Chrysler Building and bolted it into place. The Chrysler Building rose to 1,046 feet overnight. It was not engineering. It was theater. It was revenge served in stainless steel. It held the title for exactly 11 months. Because in 1931, the Empire State Building opened. It was built in 410 days. That number is almost impossible to process. The building stands 1,454 feet tall, including its antenna, has 102 floors, and was constructed by a workforce of up to 3,400 men per day. Many of them Mohawk ironworkers from the Kahnawake community in Quebec, whose extraordinary fearlessness at height made them the most sought-after high steel workers in the Northeast. Architectural historian Carol Willis, founder of the Skyscraper Museum in New York, has written extensively about how the Empire State Building was deliberately designed to look modular, to look like it could be disassembled and rebuilt elsewhere, because its investors were not certain the market for sky-high office space would survive the Great Depression. They were hedging their bets against the sky itself. The building lost money for years. New Yorkers called it the Empty State Building. It is now one of the most valuable and visited pieces of real estate on the planet. But the story of New York's architecture is not only a story of height, it is also a story of what happens when a city destroys something it cannot get back. In 1963, the original Pennsylvania station was demolished. What was torn down was not just a building, it was a cathedral of civic ambition, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece with a main waiting room modeled on the baths of Caracalla in ancient Rome, with granite columns rising 80 feet and a vaulted ceiling that made every ordinary traveler feel, for one moment, that their journey mattered. Architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in the New York Times that the destruction of Penn Station marked the moment New York entered what she called the age of the replaceable environment. The public grief that followed was so loud and so sustained that it directly produced the New York City Landmarks Preservation Law in 1965, a piece of legislation that has since protected over 37,000 buildings and sites across the 5 boroughs. Penn Station's demolition gave the city the legal tools to protect everything that remained. Grand Central Terminal, which was already in the crosshairs of developers, survived because Penn Station died first. What does it mean when a city learns its most important lessons from grief? The second half of the 20th century brought a new philosophy to Manhattan streets. Not just height, but dialogue. Not just glass, but conversation between old stone and new steel. Architect and historian Robert A. M. Stern, who served as dean of the Yale School of Architecture and has designed dozens of buildings across the city, has described New York's architectural identity as essentially improvisational. A city that never had one master plan, never had one controlling aesthetic vision, and therefore became the most visually layered urban environment on Earth. Every decade left its mark. Dutch colonial, federal brick, Beaux-Arts marble, Art Deco steel, modernist glass curtain walls, postmodern ornament. Each style argued with the one before it. The argument never resolved. The argument became the city. Then September 11, 2001, changed what the skyline meant entirely.